I've always thought of myself as lucky. My career as an artist thrived, my home was filled with warmth, and my marriage to Mark felt like the kind people wrote novels about. We were the couple everyone admired, supportive, loving, and deeply connected. Or so I believed. Our life together had been a masterpiece in my mind, each moment painted with strokes of devotion and shared dreams. The walls of our home were adorned with canvases that told stories of our journey, vibrant sunsets from our honeymoon, quiet, still lives inspired by lazy Sunday mornings, and abstract pieces born from late night conversations over glasses of wine. To the outside world, and even to me, we seemed untouchable, a portrait of perfection. But perfection is fragile, and cracks can form when you least expect them. It all began one afternoon while I was preparing for an upcoming exhibition. Sorting through old files, I stumbled upon something that shattered my illusion of marital bliss, a stack of letters between Mark and Anna, his former colleague. At first glance, they appeared innocent enough. Notes exchanged during what I assumed were long work hours or stressful projects. But as I sifted through the pages, a subtle undercurrent revealed itself. Their words weren't overtly romantic, but there was an intimacy in their tone that made my stomach churn. Casual remarks carried layers of familiarity, inside jokes hinted at shared experiences, and lingering sign-offs like "thinking of you" left me questioning everything I thought I knew. I tried to dismiss it at first. Just harmless exchanges from years ago, right? People write things they don't mean all the time. Yet, the more I read, the louder the doubts grew. Had Mark ever truly moved past Anna? Was this connection just a relic of the past? Or something deeper, something unresolved? And if these letters were merely remnants of history, why did they feel so present now? My hands trembled as I set the stack aside, staring blankly at the cluttered desk before me. For years, I'd prided myself on building a solid foundation with Mark, one rooted in trust and mutual respect. But here I was confronted with evidence that maybe that foundation wasn't as sturdy as I'd imagined. Maybe the cracks had always been there, hidden beneath layers of routine and complacency. The weight of uncertainty settled heavily on my chest. Who was Anna to him now? A distant memory? Or someone who still occupied space in his heart, however small? And what did that mean for us, for me? As the sunlight streaming through the window dimmed with the approaching evening, I realized I couldn't ignore this discovery. Whatever truths lay buried within those letters demanded answers. But seeking them meant risking the very fabric of what we had built together. Could I face the possibility that my seemingly perfect marriage might be built on lies? For the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder, how well did I really know my husband? And how much of our love story was real versus the version I'd painted in my mind? The weight of the letters I'd found pressed heavily on my chest as Lisa and I sat across from each other at our favorite cafe. The air was warm, but a chill ran through me every time I thought about the words between Mark and Anna, their tones so intimate, so familiar. It wasn't overtly romantic, not in the way that screamed betrayal, but it was enough to plant seeds of doubt deep within me. I don't know what to think, I confessed, my voice trembling as I leaned forward, clutching my coffee cup like it might steady the storm inside me. These letters, they're not explicit, but they make me question everything. Did I miss something all these years? Was there ever more than just friendship between them? Lisa listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. She had always been my rock, the one person who could ground me when life felt unsteady. But even she seemed unsure how to respond this time. After a moment, she asked gently, "Have you talked to Mark about this?" My stomach tightened at the suggestion. Talking to Mark meant confronting the truth head on, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. What if his answer shattered the fragile illusion of our marriage? Or worse, what if he didn't have an answer at all? "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "I'm scared of what he might say, or worse, what he won't say. As we continued talking, neither of us noticed the figure standing outside the cafe window. Mark had come to surprise me during my break, perhaps hoping to share a quiet moment together amidst our busy lives. Instead, he stood frozen, his face pale with shock as he listened to every word I spoke. His expression shifted from confusion to hurt, then finally to something unreadable, a mixture of guilt and resignation. For a long moment, he lingered there, torn between stepping inside to confront me or retreating entirely. In the end, he chose neither. Without saying a word, he turned and walked away, leaving behind only silence and later, a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen counter. I need time to figure out what matters to us. When I returned home later that evening, the emptiness of the house hit me before anything else. Mark's absence was palpable, and my heart sank as I spotted the note where he usually left reminders or grocery lists. The sight of his handwriting sent a pang of guilt through me. I hadn't intended for him to overhear my doubts, hadn't wanted to wound him without first understanding the full story. Yet here we were, separated by uncertainty and fear. Sinking onto the couch, I replayed the day's events in my mind. How could things have unraveled so quickly? One discovery, one conversation, and suddenly the foundation of our marriage felt precarious. Had I pushed too hard too soon? Or had I simply been blind to cracks that had existed for far longer than I cared to admit? What frightened me most wasn't just the possibility of betrayal. It was the realization that I didn't fully know the man I'd built my life around. And now, faced with the prospect of losing him, I understood how much I still needed him. Not the version of him I'd imagined, but the real, flawed person who had shared my joys and sorrows, my triumphs and failures. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to carry the weight of unanswered questions. All I could think about was Mark, where he was, what he was feeling, whether he would come back. And though I didn't yet realize it, his note wasn't just a plea for space. It was a cry for help, for both of us to rediscover what truly mattered before it was too late. When I returned home and found the empty house, panic set in like a cold wave crashing over me. The silence was deafening, each creak of the floorboards magnified in my ears as I called out for Mark, hoping against hope that he'd simply stepped outside or retreated to another room. But deep down, I already knew he wasn't here. My heart sank when I spotted the note on the kitchen counter, his familiar handwriting scrawled across the page. I need time to figure out what matters to us. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Time? What did that even mean? Was he questioning everything about our marriage, just as I had been doing since finding those letters? Guilt twisted inside me, sharp and unrelenting. I replayed every interaction we'd shared recently, dissecting them for signs I might have missed. Had I been too distracted by my work, too dismissive of his feelings? How many times had I brushed off his attempts at connection because I was busy with deadlines or exhibitions? For years, I prided myself on being independent, on building a life where I didn't need anyone. Not really. But now, faced with the possibility of losing him, I realized how much I depended on Mark's quiet presence, even if I hadn't fully appreciated it before. His support had become invisible to me, overshadowed by my own ambitions and routines. And yet, without it, the foundation of my world felt dangerously unstable. As the hours stretched on, I allowed myself to confront truths I'd buried beneath layers of denial. I had taken Mark for granted, his kindness, his patience, his unwavering loyalty. He had always been there, steady and dependable, while I chased accolades and recognition. Now, standing alone in our quiet home, I understood what truly mattered. It wasn't the awards hanging on my studio wall or the glowing reviews from critics. It was this man who had stood beside me through thick and thin, asking for so little in return. But regret wasn't enough. If I wanted to salvage what we had, I needed to act, to show him that I valued him more than anything else. For the first time in years, I considered therapy a step I never thought we'd need. We were supposed to be the couple everyone admired, the ones who had it all figured out. Admitting we needed help felt like admitting failure. Yet, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at Mark's note, I realized that pride wouldn't save us. Only honesty could. To my immense relief, when I finally reached Mark later that evening, he agreed to try therapy. His voice was calm but distant, his expression guarded during our brief conversation. Still, the fact that he hadn't shut me out completely gave me a sliver of hope. Maybe this was our chance to rebuild. Not just the fragments of our relationship, but the trust and intimacy that had eroded over time. That night, sleep eluded me. Every sound outside, the rustle of leaves, the hum of distant traffic, felt amplified, taunting me with reminders of how fragile our bond had become. I lay awake, replaying memories of happier times. Lazy Sunday mornings spent reading side by side, spontaneous road trips where laughter filled the car, the way his hand used to linger on mine as if he couldn't bear to let go. Those moments hadn't vanished. They were still there, buried beneath years of neglect and miscommunication. And perhaps they could be unearthed again. Determined to make things right, I resolved to approach therapy not as an obligation, but as an opportunity to rediscover the man I fell in love with, to listen instead of assuming, to nurture instead of taking for granted. Because now, more than ever, I understood what losing him would cost me. Not just a partner, but a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost until it was almost gone. Mark may have walked away today, but I refused to let him disappear forever. Whatever it took, I would fight for us, for the love that once felt unshakable and the future I still believed we could build together. The therapist's office was a neutral space, with soft lighting and muted colors that seemed designed to calm even the most frayed nerves. Yet, as Eva and Mark sat across from each other on those stiff chairs, the air between them felt anything but peaceful. At first, their words were cautious, measured. Each sentence weighed for potential harm before it left their lips. They tiptoed around the truth, afraid of what might happen if they stepped too far. "It wasn't Anna," Mark said one day, his voice heavy with regret, breaking through the careful facade they had built over weeks of therapy. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and he avoided meeting Eva's eyes. "She was just someone I could talk to when I felt like you weren't listening." The confession hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I never stopped loving you, Eva, but sometimes I felt invisible." Eva's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. The weight of his words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew there was truth in what he said. Her heart broke, not just for herself, but for him, for the loneliness he must have carried silently all these years. "I didn't mean to neglect you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. "I thought if I succeeded, if I kept pushing forward, it would make us stronger, that my achievements would somehow fill the gaps between us." She looked at him, then really looked at him, seeing the pain etched into the lines of his face. "But I see now that love isn't about achievements or accomplishments. It's about connection. And I failed at that." Mark nodded slowly, his expression softening. There was no anger in his gaze, only sadness, and perhaps a flicker of hope. For the first time in months, maybe even years, they were truly seeing each other, stripped of defenses and pretenses. The therapist, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward slightly. "What Mark is describing isn't uncommon," she said gently. "Anna wasn't the problem. She was a trigger, a reminder of something deeper that has been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. The real issue lies in your inability to communicate openly. Love requires vulnerability, and trust takes effort." Her words struck a chord in both of them. Eva realized how often she had dismissed Mark's attempts to share his feelings, brushing them aside because she was preoccupied with her own goals. And Mark acknowledged how he had retreated into silence rather than confronting the distance growing between them. "Do you remember when we used to sit on the porch after dinner?" Mark asked suddenly, his tone softer now, almost wistful. "We'd talk about everything, the kids, our dreams, the little things that made us laugh. Those moments, they meant so much to me." Eva nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I miss that too," she admitted. "Somewhere along the way, we stopped making time for those conversations. I don't know why. Because life got busy," Mark said simply, "and because neither of us wanted to admit we were struggling." The honesty in his voice was disarming, and Eva found herself reaching out, placing her hand tentatively over his. To her relief, he didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his palm upward, intertwining their fingers. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a bridge being rebuilt plank by plank. As the session drew to a close, the therapist offered one final thought. "Rebuilding trust won't happen overnight. It will take patience, consistency, and a willingness to be vulnerable, even when it's uncomfortable. But the fact that you're here, working through this together, is a good sign." Walking out of the office that day, Eva felt a strange mix of emotions: sorrow for the years they had lost, guilt for her role in their struggles, but also hope. Hope that they could find their way back to each other. Not as the perfect couple they once imagined themselves to be, but as two imperfect people committed to trying again. For the first time in a long while, Eva allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their love story wasn't over. It was simply evolving into something more honest, more real, something worth fighting for. Weeks later, Mark came back, not with grand gestures or apologies, but with a simple promise: "Let's start over." The words hung in the air between us, fragile yet powerful, like the first brushstroke on an empty canvas. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and watched as he set down his bag by the door. His presence filled the house again, not as it had before, when we were merely coexisting, but as something new, tentative, and raw. That evening, we sat across from each other at the dining table, the absence of phones creating a quiet intimacy neither of us had realized we'd lost. For so long, our meals had been silent affairs, punctuated only by the clink of cutlery or the occasional murmur about mundane tasks. But now, laughter bubbled up unexpectedly as Mark recounted a funny story from work. It felt foreign yet familiar, like rediscovering a melody you hadn't heard in years. "Remember when we used to do this every night?" Mark asked, his voice soft. "Just talk." "I remember," I replied, smiling despite the pang of guilt that still lingered. "I miss it." "Well," he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes meeting mine, "we can have it back, if we want it." And so we began again, not perfectly, but intentionally. Evening walks became sacred rituals, where the cool breeze carried our words into the twilight. We spoke honestly about everything: the cracks in our marriage, the dreams we'd shelved, the fears that kept us awake at night. Some conversations were harder than others, dredging up old wounds I thought had healed. Yet through it all, there was a shared determination, a belief that what we had was worth saving. Eva learned to prioritize Mark's emotional needs, carving out space for him in ways she hadn't before. She stopped letting her career overshadow their connection, making time to listen without distractions. Meanwhile, Mark worked tirelessly on expressing himself more openly. He no longer retreated into silence when things grew difficult. Instead, he faced challenges head-on, even if his voice trembled with vulnerability. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, tears spilled in the privacy of dimly lit rooms, and nights when doubt crept in like shadows under the door. One particularly heated argument left both of us exhausted, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, staring at the floor. "This is impossible," I whispered finally, my voice breaking. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe, but giving up feels worse. His honesty startled me, and after a beat, I laughed, a small, shaky sound that broke the tension. You're right, I admitted. It does. Slowly, we found our rhythm again. Small acts of kindness wove themselves into our daily lives. A cup of coffee brewed just the way I liked it, a note left on the counter reminding me to take a break, a warm hand reaching for mine during a quiet moment. These gestures weren't grand declarations of love, but they were enough. They reminded us of why we'd chosen each other in the first place. One evening, as we walked along the path by the river, Mark stopped suddenly and turned to face me. Do you think we'll ever get back to how we were? He asked, his tone hesitant. I shook my head. No, and maybe we shouldn't. What we had wasn't perfect. It couldn't be. But what we're building now, it feels real. Stronger, somehow. He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Yeah, me too. In those quiet moments, I realized something profound. Love isn't static. It evolves, shifts, and sometimes fractures under pressure. But if nurtured with care and effort, it can heal and grow stronger than ever before. Together, we were learning to embrace imperfection, to find beauty in the messy, unpolished parts of ourselves and our relationship. As the weeks turned into months, the distance between us continued to close. Our home once again became a sanctuary, not because it was flawless, but because it was ours. And those scars remained, reminders of the pain we'd endured. They no longer defined us. Instead, they served as testaments to our resilience, proof that we could weather storms together. We weren't the same couple we'd been before, but perhaps that was the point. Love, I realized, wasn't about clinging to an idealized version of happiness. It was about choosing each other day after day, even when the road was rocky. And as we stood side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. Months passed, and their bond grew stronger than ever. The cracks that had once threatened to shatter their marriage were now filled with a newfound understanding, built brick by brick through vulnerability, effort, and commitment. Eva no longer saw their relationship as something static, a fixed entity immune to change, but rather as a living, breathing partnership that required constant care and attention. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of frustration, disagreements that lingered longer than they should, and days when the weight of life felt overwhelming. But what had changed was how they approached those challenges, not as adversaries, but as allies. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and indigo, Eva and Mark found themselves strolling hand in hand along a quiet path near their home. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, and the world seemed to pause under the vast expanse of stars beginning to twinkle above them. For the first time in months, Eva felt an unshakable sense of peace, a calm certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Do you remember, she began, her voice soft but steady, when we used to think love was enough? Mark chuckled softly, the sound warm and familiar. Yeah, he replied, glancing down at her with a smile. Turns out, it's just the beginning. Eva nodded, her fingers tightening around his. She looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude for the man beside her, the man who had chosen to stay, to fight, to rebuild what they had nearly lost. You're right, she said, her tone thoughtful. Love is a feeling, but it's also a decision, a choice to show up, even when it's hard, even when you don't feel like it. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth yet lightened by the shared journey they had endured. Mark stopped walking, turning to face her fully. His eyes searched hers, reflecting the same devotion she felt blooming in her chest. And I choose you, he said simply, his voice unwavering. Every day, no matter what. Tears pricked at the corners of Eva's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of joy, of love reborn. She reached up to cup his cheek, her thumb brushing gently against his skin. "I choose you too," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Always." In that moment, beneath the starlit sky, everything felt clear. Love wasn't about grand gestures or fleeting passion. It was about the small, deliberate choices made every single day. It was in the way Mark listened intently when she spoke, even after a long day at work. It was in the way Eva prioritized his happiness, ensuring he never felt invisible again. It was in the laughter they shared over dinner, the quiet comfort of sitting side by side on the couch, and the unspoken promise to keep showing up for each other no matter the obstacles ahead. Mark leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. His lips lingered there for a moment before he pulled back, his gaze meeting hers once more. "We've got this, Eva," he said, his voice firm yet tender. "Together." The simplicity of his words struck her deeply. Together. That was the key, not just in marriage, but in life itself. They weren't two separate individuals trying to coexist. They were partners bound by a shared history and a mutual desire to build a future worth fighting for. As they resumed their walk, Eva felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their relationship wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past or the fears that had once consumed them. Instead, it was shaped by the lessons they had learned, the walls they had torn down, and the love they had chosen to nurture. When they finally returned home, the house was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. Eva paused in the doorway, watching as Mark moved to turn on the kettle in the kitchen. He glanced back at her, catching her gaze, and offered a small smile, one that carried the weight of all they had overcome and the hope of all they could still become. For the first time in years, Eva didn't feel the need to question their future. She knew it wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. Love, she realized, wasn't just a noun, it was a verb. And every action they took, every word they spoke, was a testament to the life they were building side by side. As she joined him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter while the tea steeped, Eva allowed herself to savor the quiet contentment of the moment. The road ahead would have its twists and turns, but one thing was certain: whatever came next, they would face it together. Looking back, Eva realized that night had changed her in ways she was still unraveling. It wasn't just the argument or the vulnerability it forced out of her, it was the reckoning that followed. For so long, she had been running on autopilot, chasing achievements while neglecting the parts of herself that craved something deeper. Understanding, presence, love. That night stripped her bare, forcing her to confront the person she had become and the pieces she had let fall by the wayside. She thought about how easy it had been to lose sight of what truly mattered, to trade connection for productivity, honesty for convenience. But now, with clarity slowly seeping in, she understood that being seen went beyond Mark's gaze or anyone else's validation. It started with her. She had spent years avoiding her own reflection, both literal and metaphorical, too afraid to face the woman staring back. But through the cracks of their struggles, she found her again, the Eva who valued kindness over perfection, effort over accolades, courage over comfort. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Not because of success or recognition, but because she had rediscovered the essence of what made life meaningful: connection. The quiet moments shared with Mark, the laughter that came without pretense, the raw honesty they were finally brave enough to embrace. It all reminded her of why they had fallen in love in the first place. Love wasn't a static thing. It was alive, messy, imperfect, and it required care. Eva also learned the weight of accountability, not as a burden, but as an act of self-respect. Admitting fault didn't diminish her, it strengthened her. Owning her mistakes allowed her to grow, to step into a version of herself she could be proud of. Honesty became her anchor, grounding her when fear threatened to pull her under. Most importantly, she realized that relationships weren't built on grand gestures or fleeting passion. They were forged in the small, deliberate choices made every day. To listen, to show up, to try, even when it felt impossible. These lessons weren't just for her marriage, they were for herself. And as she stood there, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, she knew one thing for certain: she would never stop trying. As they stood there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the night, Eva felt the weight of everything they had been through settle gently around her like a familiar blanket. The air was cool against her skin, the stars above shimmering with a soft, steady light that mirrored the hope growing in her chest. She glanced at Mark, his profile illuminated faintly by the moonlight, and realized how far they had come, not just from where they were months ago, but from who they used to be. Eva knew their journey wasn't perfect, and perhaps it never would be. Life had taught her that relationships weren't about avoiding storms, they were about learning to weather them together. What mattered most wasn't perfection, it was effort. It was showing up, even when it was hard. It was choosing each other, day after day, despite the cracks and imperfections. "We've got this," Mark said softly, as if reading her thoughts. His voice carried no arrogance, only quiet determination. Eva turned to him, meeting his gaze, and nodded. In that moment, she understood what love truly meant: trust built brick by brick, communication nurtured word by word, and a bond strengthened not by absence of conflict, but by the courage to face it head on. The world beyond them still hummed with its chaos. The same pressures, uncertainties, and challenges awaited. But here, under the vast expanse of the night sky, Eva felt an unshakable peace. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. Together. Perfection wasn't the goal anymore. What mattered was the honesty, the vulnerability, and the unwavering commitment to building something real, something enduring. And as they walked back inside, hand in hand, Eva allowed herself to believe that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. After all, love wasn't about finding someone flawless. It was about creating something beautiful out of broken pieces.